Hi, my name is Roger Zemek. I'm a pediatric emergency physician at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, as well as an associate professor at the University of Ottawa in the departments of pediatrics and emergency medicine. I'm here today to talk about what predicts how children recover following their concussion injury. My objectives for you today are the following. First, to talk about how do we go about determining how do we predict ongoing symptoms. Second, talk to you about the predicting persistent post-concussive problems in pediatrics, otherwise known as the 5P study. And lastly, talk about how the predictors of 5P relate to ongoing symptoms. So I want to start with a case vignette. I work in the emergency department, and this is a typical case. It's not a real patient, but one based on ones that we see on a regular basis. So let's say you're working and there's a 14-year-old girl who collided during soccer. She didn't lose consciousness. She remembers what happened, but she was unsteady on her feet. She was slow to answer questions, but she had headache, feeling foggy and tired, and following the if in doubt, sit them out, the coach rightly removed her from the game. She's brought to the emergency department to be evaluated, and there, in the waiting room, with the bright lights and loud noises, is having worsening symptoms. But on talking to her, you learn that she's never had a concussion before, and she's never had migraine headaches before, and when you do the SCAT-5, your normal testing is all normal. But when you do her balance testing, doing the best, you find that her tandem stance does have multiple errors. And using the determination of who needs a CT, she does not require any structural imaging in the emergency department. So the doctor diagnoses her with a concussion. And what happens next is parents will always ask two questions. One, when is my child going to get better? And two, when can they go back doing the things they love doing, especially their sport? We're going to focus on the first one today. So can we predict the duration of how long symptoms last following a concussion? So the goal of the 5P study was to using clinically available factors determine who goes on to having symptoms or not. And this is really a rule that could be used for anyone. You don't need fancy blood tests or fancy CT imaging or MRI imaging that's even experimental at this point. So this study again looked at kids who came to the emergency department, and so they were very early on in their injury course. The average child presented to the study within 3 hours of having their concussion. We studied those children along the injury course, 1 week, 2 week, 4 week, 8 week, and 12 week, and we did all different measurements to things that might predict how well they do. First thing we found out is that, good news, most kids get better. Some kids, however, go on and have symptoms, and if you see, at 1 month, 30% of children are still having symptoms. So even though we looked at over 70 variables, there were 40 of them that went on to be significant as predictors, meaning that they may correlate to how long children's symptoms last. But life doesn't work in one at a time, life works in combination. So what we did using more advanced techniques was to look, and we were able to narrow down predictors into 5 main categories. So the first category was what we called demographics. Are you a young kid or older kid, or are you a boy or girl? And what we found was older teenagers did worse than the younger children. Second, we found that girls were almost twice as more likely to have ongoing symptoms as boys were. The second category was their past history. It did not matter if they had a loss of consciousness. It did not matter if they had numerous prior concussions. What mattered was, if you had a prior concussion, how long did that one last? And those that recovered very quickly were at lower risk. Personal history of migraine is that second past medical history factor. Although we did numerous measurement tests of children's memory and how well they remembered numbers and how well they remembered words, none of those factors were predictive. More importantly, was the simple question was, is your child answering questions slowly? Which was also putting children at increased risk if they were. The fourth factor is how well children did on their balance testing, in particular the balance test when they are walking an imaginary tightrope where one foot is in the other and holding that position as part of the tandem stance best. And those children who had more problems with that went on to have higher risk of symptoms lasting a month or more. And then finally, although we asked 20+ symptoms of ongoing basis and measuring how they compared to how they were doing before the injury, of all the symptoms, there were 3 that were most predictive of having ongoing symptoms. And that was presence of headache, sensitivity to noise, and fatigue. All those points were assigned a 0 to 2, and the total number of possible points was 12. From that, we were able to get several cutoffs. We were able to determine that children who had 3 points or less were almost 3 times less likely to have ongoing symptoms. Conversely, those kids who had points 9 or more were 3 times more likely to have ongoing symptoms. So what the 5P score was able to do is break children into a low risk, medium risk, and high risk group. So let's apply the 5P rule to the vignette that I gave you earlier. So we had our 14-year-old girl who collided in soccer. She was unsteady but didn't lose consciousness, and she remembered everything. She had headache, feeling foggy and tired. Her symptoms got worse with the loud noises, but her history of prior concussion and migraine were normal, and she had normal remembering of the digit spans and of the words we gave her in our testing, and her balance, however, had multiple errors. So let's apply it point by point. So if you look, she's a teenager, gives her 2 points. She's a girl, she gets another 2 points. She's never had a concussion, so 0. Never a migraine, so 0. She was answering questions slowly, that gave her another. Tandem stance balance problems, another. Headache, sensitivity to noise, and fatigue, giving her a total of 10 points out of 12, which actually puts her at high risk. If you want to learn more about this study and all the factors that we examined and how we did the more advanced techniques on how to determine which factors predict better than others, we published this paper in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it's actually a free download online on the JAMA website. Lastly, it's my pleasure to tell you about our study. Although I was the lead of this study, it was a team effort in which we had numerous scientists all over Canada and North America and the world. Thank you very much for listening to me talk to you today about pediatric concussions and how we address the first question, how do we predict concussions? As researchers, we're going to now tackle that second question. How do we better get kids back to doing the things they love doing, including their sports?